Will welcome.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me, Ralph. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to connect with your audience. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Ralph said, I'm Will Leverson, current candidate, Republican candidate for the city of Racine's 66th Assembly District seat, which is not the entirety of the city. It's Racine, all of Racine, south of Melvin to 21st Street. Things get really interesting around Durand, as the other gentleman that arrived with me, the other adjacent to Kenosha, as a matter of fact, Ed Hipsch, who's running against Tip McGuire.
I met Ed yesterday too for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were to be fair, we were not there just solely as Republican folks that tout the party line of backing the blue. We were there because regardless in this conversation, we're going to have to find a way to help fund our safety component, which is our law enforcement agencies, to make sure that we can continue to keep all of our friends, families, and neighbors safe from harm.
Sure.
And so we want to make sure that we do is to bring a real conservative message to every household here in our state to help move our state in the right direction. Because certainly having one side, and this is, you have to forgive me for not being too familiar with things in Kenosha, but certainly in the city of Racine, most of the folks that have not done the best diligence by folks there, and I'm being kind because we are on radio here, and I'm not sure if this is a family show. But I just want to make sure that folks understand that this isn't some diatribe, this isn't some party line of the right. We have a serious problem endemic to Racine, and it's been one-party rule by Democrats who have fleeced our city for resources and monies over these 50-some-odd years. I'm 38 years old. I'm saying 50 because that's just being fair to the span of time that they've been in power there. And one of the things that I wanted to share here tonight is why it's so important that we bring our conservative message to every household, is that in our lifetime, certainly Ralph, you and I are nearly in the same peer group. We are. And then for folks that are just a few summers older than us, the Democrats and folks certainly here in our state are not these well-meaning folks. Some of the things that they have, when you have these conversations about law enforcement, in our city, in Racine, law enforcement professionals who are men and women who, regardless of how I feel personally about things, I'll still have to represent. And I'll still have to make sure they have all the tools available to do their jobs and to get home to their families the same way that I did when I was a sailor. There was budgeting and allocation of funds and policy that helped bring me home. There were many times when it fell short, many times. But that's why we ascribe ourselves to be a country under God, indivisible. And I believe that faith it should be always a component. And that's not what we're doing right now. We're not doing our diligence in good faith by some of those men and women who wear that uniform, who do a thankless job a lot of days. These are the people that, even when we have our issues and something is happening to someone we love, we'll have to dial our 911, and we'll have to go through dispatch, and they'll have to dispatch a law enforcement professional to respond to our present danger.
And we hope that we have enough well-funded, well-trained people on the street that somebody can get there in short order and not drain the resources, because resources can get spread thin very quickly.
Oh, absolutely. And when it comes sort of to the urgency of the hour, this is what the often celebrated longest-serving President pro tempore of our Senate, who was the prior chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee before there was one, Joe Biden, who took Strom Thurmond's place. But this is what Strom Thurmond had to say as the nation was facing the question as to whether or not we would desegregate. And there was a gentleman who was occupying the White House at that time, someone who had seen all sorts of horrors of war, known the tragedy that it is when men aren't able to fight in a cohesive fighting force. That person, that president, was Dwight Eisenhower. He was just about to sign, or hoped to sign, the Civil Rights Act, 1957. This is what Strom Thurmond, who birds of a feather do flock together, And as he is celebrated in all those halls of democratic thinking, this is what Strom Thurmond had to say about, well, I'll get personal about my people's freedom here. The Civil Rights Act simply means that it's another means, that it's another effort on the part of this president to dominate the country by force and to put into effect these uncalled for and the damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights. And I tell you, the American people, from one side to the other, had better wake up and oppose such a program. And if they don't, the next thing will be a totalitarian state in these United States. And that is the same gentleman who was succeeded by Joe Biden in the Senate Judiciary Committee, the same gentleman that I'm sure that everyone knows was an architect of some 1994 crime bill. These are the people that, there was a gentleman who penned a book when I was a young sailor. It was a conservative gentleman, and that was Bill O'Reilly. And his book was Who's Looking Out for You? And that's the question that we all ask ourselves here now, right? If you're a law enforcement professional, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, we're dealing with a new contagion, an insidious virus that we don't fully understand, yet we are blessed that it is not a high percentage killer. That is the fact. That is not a party line. It is not a hantavirus, which is also a pulmonary disease, a far, far more insidious contagion that is a nearly 30% killer. We have a virus that, while it is new, the same defenses that our bodies have had since we've been human, Ralph. This isn't something that's new to us. This isn't a monster that dropped out of into the Lake Michigan and crawled on our shores and now it's attacking our lungs because that's where it wants to infect us. That's not what's going on.
Well, you would think that it was, because you see people walking around by themselves in the open air with masks over their faces. So, I wonder when I see that, what they're protecting themselves from when they're not even in close quarters with other people.
And that's and I want to get back to the event, and I apologize, Ralph, but I just wanted to.
Well, we've got plenty of time. Don't worry.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to have an opportunity to really connect there with the audience there. So this isn't once again, some diatribe of two like-minded individuals. Ralph and I had two different vantage points in this, but my response to that same gentleman, and to be fair, I'm a business consultant, so I'm a little bit better than a lawyer. I just get paid less hourly. So
more ethics, less money?
Yep, absolutely. And so when Ed and I arrived, as we're driving up, and Ralph probably didn't get a chance to see this, nor did many, because their attention was once again toward that center area that Ralph was describing. Ed and I are driving up, and as we're arriving, my amateur comic brain, I used to do a little bit of amateur comedy down in not far from where Ralph will be, there at the Improv there in Ybor City, and at Side Splitters in Carrollwood. But as we're driving up, and as I happen to see, I said, well, we see the Black Lives Matter. Well, what these people claim to have been Black Lives Matter. We saw it was BLM and all that, but I didn't see a single person that looked like me at all. There was not. That's not me, signifying or trying to make light of anyone's beliefs. I'm not disparaging anyone, but really, seriously, we're driving up here, and there was not a single black person in that crowd.
I said on social media that there were more black people in the Back the Blue rally than there were on the counter protest, and I was shot down and basically told I was full of beans, and I just don't understand how two people can look at the exact same thing and see two entirely different things, but I guess that's what perspective is all about.
And so Ed and I were parking, and to be fair, the commentary that perhaps a certain group or what calls itself to be Black Lives Matter may not be effectively represented or otherwise speaking for that impacted group of people, I can't feel like they are, once again, because I could see if it was some organized thing. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was some loose affiliation of like-minded souls or allies or how they call themselves, and that was fine. But what was
Well,
it?
it was a failed school board candidate, Kyle Flood, who I guess is one of the candidates. This guy, I think, got booted out of the school board for smoking marijuana when he was got arrested for smoking marijuana while he was a school board member in college or something like that. And the guy's kind of a loose cannon, and from what I understand from some of his posts, he was one of the organizers. He's not an African American either.
And that would make sense. And that's, and that's a very quick breakdown. And one thing that voters in the 66 won't have to worry about is if there's a gentleman that kind of has an intimate understanding. I understand operational tempo, and that was a very quick sort of a scenario there where you could observe that maybe that group wasn't an organized group of people. And so I didn't think that there was any harm going to come that day. Not at all.
Neither did I.
And as David Clark, Sheriff Clark, as Ralph was describing, was amongst these people. He's 6'4" with a cowboy hat, and he's a well-known figure. So he's not easy to miss.
No, I think his hat's taller than me.
Oh yeah, absolutely, taller than most, Ralph. And so once the protesters, and I'm sure they saw him, and that's where they made their way from the courthouse. And once again, they were still assembled in what I thought was on the corner, otherwise still not in any aggressive posturing. And lo and behold, there's these gentlemen walking up. As Ralph said, there was some folks that were walking up, and they were getting getting shouted at, and there wasn't any. I didn't see anything thrown. I didn't see anything yet. I just heard the stuff, and there was a gentleman banging his grandma's pot, I guess, that he picked up or something, told her he was going to cook some lunch. I don't know. So he's banging this pot, and he's getting closer toward the area where David Clark and the folks are in the middle. And then all of a sudden, this senior gentleman, he had to be maybe in the 60s, and he had on one of those POW Harley Davidson sort of things. And I think he may have had some pro law enforcement patches or something like that, or nothing that was obscene or anything. And the gentleman that Ralph described, that you can see, because this other gentleman was like 6'2", so there's David Clark and this other tall guy from this protest, right? And so he begins to make his way toward this gentleman. He's shouting something. The gentleman turns back around, and he maybe flips him the bird or something. There really wasn't anything that would have warranted an assault, and that's what followed. That same senior citizen was shoved to the ground, and it wasn't one of those things to where, it wasn't that hard. No, this is a gentleman that certainly, if it were on concrete, would have harmed himself. So what called my attention is that the shouting or the banging, because the gentleman was coming back through with his
banging his grandma's pots and pans.
Yeah.
You said, yeah,
or at least I hope they were his grandma's pots and pans. My goodness, I don't know if he picked them up. He was kind of beatniky, so he might have picked them up from the trash or something and reused it. I don't know, but it was certainly used at that point. But and so here they are, and they're on this corner, and this gentleman's walking up, and so now this guy's rushing him. He actually pushes him down, and then he begins to sort of tackle him. So first, this gentleman hits the ground because this guy got leverage over him. And he had to be 5'7", 5'8", and this other guy is 6'2", rushing at him, and he's not expecting this. So the guy hits the ground with a thud, and then the guy stands over him and then begins to, what I can only observe at that point was getting on. Now, he wasn't hitting this guy, but he kind of climbed on top of him. And then the gentleman that was in this reporter, or who claims to be a reporter for the Kenosha News outlet there, the picture that he took and put on or used that in that tagging was very near the end of the assault. That person that was pictured on top of that demonstrator or protester was with that gentleman, or otherwise was close enough to stop that gentleman from further harming that senior citizen.
So in your estimation, it wasn't a bunch of people jumping on the protester. It was him pulling the protester off and doing what? Subduing him? Was he assaulting him? What was he doing?
Right. And they did exchange what looked to be blows, or otherwise they both had their hands like they were boxing, but I didn't see anyone get socked and punched or anything like that, but they must have at least swung at each other.
So it was not a 2-on-1 type of situation from what you saw the whole thing happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I'm roughly, and it's not something where I was observing from where Ralph was, or even adjacent to. This happened, if it was 15 feet away, that would have been too far. It had to be within at least 10 feet.
Gotcha.
And so I'm looking at this, and all I'm kind of just shouting, honestly, at the other protesters, saying, "Hey, no one asked you to come here. Get back across the street. Get back across the street." And actually, that's where the police kind of drove up, and they didn't have to break anything up really, because it kind of settled down, and guys kind of went to their sides. Sheriff David Clark was still okay, even though he had his firearm on him, which Wisconsin does have reciprocity law. So that wasn't something that was done for a statement. That was done for protection for himself, and I'm sure for others. You have these the cops are so they're not in any aggressive posture, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. And as Ralph said, getting the protesters back on their side of the street. So that's basically probably when you were able to take a look and see what was going
on. I'm guessing that's about the time, because I came back from walking my wife, my daughter, and our puppy away, and then I went back. And by the time I went back, I actually saw one of the people who was attending the rally getting handcuffed. Don't know what happened, but I just made my way back to the center. I saw that it was over with, I made my way back to the center because we still had a job to do.
Yeah, and that's pretty much when I turned around and joined Ed again, as I believe that the Blue rally was to commence, and so I didn't actually see the gentleman get handcuffed. Maybe that's what the officers did to respond to kind of break up things if there was anything further. But so after that, there was still some shouting, but generally after that, it was a peaceful interaction. But on the and I apologize, I'm not a journalist. I'm a business consultant. I like to, once again, help people make money with their best business decisions there. But what the commentary was from this gentleman, that once again, I'm not sure if he's a journalist, because I didn't see any principles being adhered to, so maybe he's a freelance. I'm not sure. But when he said that he didn't care about who started it, and then the other commentary where he's showing this picture, I had to respond, because I also was tagged in this. And I felt, for integrity and for other things, I am representing everyone. So if they're black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific American, what have you, probably down to a gray alien if they're here, I'll have to make sure that I do my best diligence by them. And so as much as I understand what our law enforcement professionals go through doing that thankless job, I understand that there's also a valid point. I mean, anything can get better, right? Except for the jets, but that's not something that all of us are able to affect. But what we can affect are our local policies. What we can affect is how we treat one another here. I can't speak for anywhere else, but I want to make sure that I represent the people of Racine from the little bit that I have as best as I can, and I cannot do that if I am blind to one argument or the other.
So you worked your way back, and what was your perception of the rest of the rally once that ended? Did you see, because I was so focused on getting my message out in an effective manner that really public speaking is already a frightening thing. People think that if you do it all the time, that it's easy, and it's easier. But, there's always that you get that little bit of stage fright inside you in the pit of your stomach, and you're getting up there and you're going to give a speech, and all you can focus on is making sure the words come out right. And that you kind of, using that ebb and flow with your audience, and everything else just kind of disappears from view, at least for me. But you were standing down there on the ground. What did you see after that?
Sheriff Clark was, and Ralph, you were able to speak, and a few other folks were able to acknowledge what we were, the spirit of what the rally was there for. And Sheriff David Clark was able to get up and speak and address his viewpoint, of course, of being retired law enforcement and the need to have meaningful discussions going forward. And we can't have those discussions without having the folks that are going to be affected, the most affected here. Now the impacted people are our law enforcement, and that's pretty much what Sheriff Clark was saying. It wasn't, once again, some support of the president. It wasn't some peripheral 2020 rally thing. It was all about what it was for, a rally to back our law enforcement professionals.
I mean, he did state his support of the president in there, but it definitely wasn't the central.
Right.
It was nowhere near the central point of his of his commentary. And I would say that even if you weren't a supporter of the president, you could probably get behind all the rest of his message. I was surprised to hear people say that they thought that his message was hateful overall, because I didn't hear anything hateful in it. And of course, people like to try and argue back and forth with me on Facebook about this. And anytime I point to a member of the black community who's also a conservative, I get told that that person isn't legitimate for one reason or another, whether it be Candace Owens, whether it be David Clark, whether it be those two comedians. I can't think of their names right now. Yeah. Of course, they're comedians and entertainers first. Whether it be, I mean, a whole host of people that I can think of. What do you say to people when they make those kind of excuses, and do you find them now trying to target those type of excuses and level those charges against you?
I would say that there are some minds that are resolved. You're not going to really be able to speak to that. But what I will tell you is that it's not difficult. The entire identity that it is to be an American of African heritage, that we've always had to work in a narrative where, just like many, and this isn't to gloss over anything, but once again, we are all a United States, and there are issues that we haven't solved since people became emancipated property. But that's not something that we don't know. That's something that we need to work and work in. And the only other way that can happen, Ralph, is if we all take our talents and to take our acumen and to insert ourselves in the process and demand a difference and demand change.
I was glad that you brought up the opposition to the original civil rights legislation in 1957 by Strom Thurmond, and how he opposed Ike Eisenhower when he was president. And of course, in 1963, it did end up getting passed, or a version of it got passed, but it ended up getting passed instead of being by the Republican Party. It was, and this is where historians get confused. They say, well, then somewhere along the line, the party switched, and the Republicans became the racists. But that isn't really what happened. How was that bill written differently, and what was the difference between the original proposed legislation in 1957 and what actually got passed in 1963? And how do you think that has affected the African American community in the United States since?
And thank you, Ralph. And that is a very fair question. The overall civil rights push was to, of course, make sure that there was equity and equality. And in 1957, we were facing desegregation at that time. Okay, 1963 hadn't happened. Thurgood Marshall. We weren't quite there just yet. We were getting there, but that hadn't happened yet. John F. Kennedy hadn't happened, neither did Bobby Kennedy. And so you have we're into Korea at that time, and once again in 1958, as a matter of fact, a year later, once we were able to get some victory into at least having a true unified world. In 1958, we have NASA, and we also have we also have from that budget standpoint, there was a very early in the year, January, there was a response, and this is something very important from Nikita Khrushchev. We had just had a terrible set of shootings and a terrible set of civil rights or lack of civil rights. And basically, Nikita Khrushchev basically said, hey, your United States can't be this country if you have all these issues. And that's why you had Dwight Eisenhower as what's celebrated in that Selma movie. I'm not sure if a lot of people were able to see that, but that was when you have Richard Nixon and some of those personalities that was in that movie. They were highlighting the era of that time. And so what we had in 57 was the beginning. What we have in 63 was a little bit more consensus, but it wasn't in any way a victory because we still have people with a carrot held out in front of them for the right to vote. We still didn't get that. That's a separate entity from any civil rights legislation, which Strom Thurmond and the Dems there who continue to keep that because that's the carrot that they hold. Every 30 years or so, we have the Voting Rights Act. which is pulled out from the other they were made separate issues at that point. So we have some civil rights legislation passed in 63, but we still have this separate entity there. And then there's, of course, Johnson's war on poverty and some other policy pieces, but these are all pulled out. There was no consensus that should have been done in 57. They got done later on, but still pulled apart, and that's where we are in our current narrative, where we keep having this carrot policy put before people, right? Because once again, we're having this conversation about defunding a public good, the one public good that we all use, that of course they all need to get better, right? Our public utilities need to get better, my goodness. But everything that we mean to have happen, those meaningful conversations can't happen without everyone there, because once again, our law enforcement, just like back in the civil rights, there's legislation being done without impacted people or without that consideration. When we have to get it right this first time, because this isn't something that we can pull out apart over years. We have to get this right. And so just like the civil rights legislation that's pulled apart, we can't do this. This is a civil right for all of us, law enforcement professional and civilian alike. If we don't make sure that we preserve life, if we don't make sure that even and I hate to use it, in a far less funded safety infrastructure, I want to make sure that they have the tools that they need to do this thankless job. There's a lot of policy pieces that folks can get information on about the campaign. They go to the Facebook Will for Racine, go to the website leversonforracine.com and find out some of those policy pieces that you'll hear me yakking about, getting dorky and geeky about on there. But overall, we have to make sure that we get this right. This is not something that I'm going to join up with some of our leadership in the legislature. We're going to get this done, Wisconsin. We're going to get this done right the first time to save life.
What would you like to see happen as a result of all this discussion? What do you think the immediate and the long-term solution is to repairing the relationship, or finally building a good relationship in the first place, because I guess there hasn't really been one, between law enforcement and the inner cities, especially in Wisconsin, because that's where you are. Racine, Milwaukee, Kenosha. What's the deal? What needs to happen?
Well, just like my experience as a sailor overseas, and this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we had some issues with sailors overseas. There was a kind of a toxic culture that you can look at any overseas press from Stars and Stripes or military.com or what have you from 1999 to 2004. You're going to find that we had some aggressive assaults. We were losing some manning. When we're down a sailor, you just don't get that person back, especially if you're overseas. Stateside is a little bit easier, but you have to get screened, and then there's all sorts of things you have to take. You get inoculated against nearly everything known to mankind. So there's a process, and so you just can't replace those people. But we had to have a different culture centered around, guess what, Ralph? Safety. Safety first, safety paramount, safety above all else.
So that includes training both law enforcement and the community how to be safe in interactions with one another?
Absolutely. One thing that I had advocated for in my congressional run in Florida and since I've been back here in Wisconsin with law enforcement, once again, this isn't some brainy guy yakking at people. This is something that in an operational understanding, I reached out to minds that would be affected by this stuff if we get it done, right? And so one of the things that I had advocated for, Ralph, and I'm still going to do it until there's no breath left in here, is to advocate for a officer's Bill of Rights. And what that is to set the healthiest expectations going forward between law enforcement, professional, and civilian alike. And notice that I don't use police and I don't use cops because, once again, this is a culture change. So a man thinks he does. That's nothing dogmatic. That is a very good principle to live by. And as we think we should do, and as we're saying that we need to have these conversations, Ralph, we have to get this right, but it has to be a culture change. Some of us that ascribe ourselves to faith will say that we understand what a circumcision of the heart means. That's what we have to have in this moment. We have to have a complete change of heart, change of policy, culture. If it's a business thing that you can understand, that you got to change our business culture around our law enforcement profession. If you can see it from a faith base, we're talking about a circumcision of the heart with how we deal with our interactions, our relationships between one another, because that's exactly what it is. You know, sometimes we don't use the terms because they can take on different connotations, but we need to have a very intimate change in how we face these issues, and also how we continue to keep our friends, family, and neighbors safe, because that is the other component to what our law enforcement professionals do. It's not just locally. They operationally, and this is not just a war hawk or someone that's has a party platform. When the aggressors that seek to change our way of life through violence, when they seek to do that harm, it's not my brothers and sisters in arms who get the call to come back from where we're taxed out overseas or where we're patrolling or standing to watch. It's those same law enforcement professionals that do that thankless job that keep our friends, family, neighbors safe from, well, each other here, but also from outside aggressors. They are the ones that'll get that call when we lost our assets, when we lost those towers. We called the fire department of New York, and we called the police department of New York.
Of course.
And that's where we are in our